Now, giving meaning to Holocaust survivors, which is my second speech. Among the empathic care events carried out by Tonglen Association, one was dedicated to two populations that have shared the same tragedy in different times in history and that have developed through their different cultures some complementary wisdom tools to deal with their own tragedy. The International Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2007 was dedicated to make it possible for the diaspora Tibetan and the diaspora's Jews to meet and share their resources. The title of the event was decided together with the Tibetan community in Italy and the Jewish community of Torino, where the event took place. And it was Jews and Tibetan facing extermination, overcoming strategies, memory and reconciliation. A public healing event held in the most popular and beautiful theater of the city and free entrance. 700 people attended to it. Both communities, Jews and Tibetans, were invited to learn from each other. Jews are expert in dealing with a long-lasting diaspora, and Tibetans are not. But they are accustomed to use their own practice when facing huge suffering, which allowed them to bear no more signs of the trauma. The same trauma that is, as a matter of fact, still present among European Jews 3 generations after the Holocaust. This mutual teaching was offered by expert and wise octogenarians of both sides. Tibetans were represented by Lama Palden Gyatso, acclaimed author of Fire Under the Snow. By the way, this is also the title of a documentary film I recommend you, made in 2008 by Japanese film director Makoto Sasa. In 1998, Palden Gyatso won the John Humphrey Freedom Award from the Canadian human rights group called Rights and Democracy. And so Jews were represented by Professor Dan Segre, one of the most important representatives of the Jewish thought in Italy, a former full professor of international relations at University of Haifa, Israel, so I'm quite sure some of you might know about him. Well, during the event, Jews explained Tibetans how to deal with the long-lasting diaspora without losing their cultural, religious and spiritual identity. I guess you know how to do it, so I won't spend the time I have in telling things you already know. It is maybe more interesting for you to hear how Tibetans like Palden Gyatso survived 35 years of torture in the Chinese concentration camps, being able to keep their mind free from traumatism and hatred. While I speak, I show you some images to make you understand what Tibetans have gone through and what is still happening to them even nowadays. I'm sure you will recognize the Jew side of the images. Images like these of both tragedies were provided from the Jewish and Tibetan community archives and were displayed during the event. They are and were very shocking. We show them because empathic care has to start from acknowledging the suffering of the other. But of course, we especially wanted this to be a healing event, so these images were not shown alone, but accompanied with live traditional music, both Jewish and Tibetan. It is also true that both populations have historically been held in the camps by music, as testified by many witnesses of both sides, and this in spite of the fact that also their torturers in both cases used music to put further pressure on them and for propaganda purposes. is the secret, I would say, of the Tibetans. While you are tortured, Padre Gyatso and other survivors say, you just want them to stop. And of course, you can feel hatred. But afterwards, you take refuge in your practice. You meditate. And in meditation, your perceptions dramatically change. And what is clear is that we all have like two levels of mind. One is the ordinary mind, affected by plenty of thoughts and emotions, and deeply conditioned by education, fear, beliefs, etc. But the other level, that is accessible in meditation and through training becomes accessible even when you do not formally meditate, is the true nature of mind, which is aware of everything, even of your enemy's ignorance and distress. Ignorance of what, you might ask? Ignorance of their own true nature. If only they could realize it, they would immediately stop inflicting suffering upon others. As what you feel from there, empathically, is that we are all one, and what harms the other, in fact, harms you. This human nature, the deep one, that we might nowadays call the cognitive aspect of the quantic field, if you want, is therefore pure goodness. Padre Gyatso explained that from the meditation state you realize how far your persecutors are from realizing it. So you feel compassion for them. And as a result, your mind will not lose itself in the negative emotions like hatred, but shall remain safely and sanely anchored in compassion. Who is strong and who is feeble then? Roles are inverted. The victim feels so strong to be able to produce compassion for its torturers. I have used this strategy myself. I'm part of the second generation and my father was Jew, and even if he could escape the Nazis searching for him and find refuge in Switzerland and never spoke about his traumatism, I had myself all the nightmares he had for a long time. As a child, I could not enter a shower cabin, nor stay in some small dark place like the home storage room. And later on, I could not stand uniforms. I remember one summer in Denmark, during an international scout meeting, I was 14 years old, the police was running after me with dogs and shouting just to prevent me from going outside the camp from the wrong side. They were shouting in Danish and I did not understand. I simply felt like being my father, with the Nazi and the dog searching for him and for me. Pure panic. I spent the whole night in a little country cemetery hidden behind a tomb, while the policemen were so worried for me. It was pure terror. Later on, my fear of uniforms became such that I had to retire from Scouts. I could not bear to see myself wearing a uniform. So compassion is what allowed me to understand how violence is produced. Compassion is what allowed me to consider any torturer as a miserable being, so unaware of its true nature that cannot but produce suffering. I owe this to the Tibetan training of the mind with meditation, and I also owe this to my father that gave me the greatest lesson of compassion when he passed away completely healed 22 years ago. He was the first dying person I cared for, and the one who, by his own death, made me understand directly how compassion frees you. I was already studying under the guidance of Sogyal Rinpoche, who's still my master, but I was far from having completed my schooling in spiritual care for the dying, so I did many errors with my father. One of those errors was that I desperately wanted to make sure he would not bring with him his Nazi traumatism. Today, I would not stir up any bad thing at the bed of a dying, of course, while I would simply be there to help them to dissolve whatever stuff might come up spontaneously. As I told before, in my family the traumatism was something we were not allowed to speak about, so I had to start from far. I noticed that he was trembling and I used this as an excuse. "Dad," I said, you are trembling because you feel cold. No. Maybe you are trembling out of some tension. No. Well, I mean, something like inner remembrances, like the time you were so sad because you're associated with such and such thing. No, darling, all these things behave to the past now, you see? And I kept on, and I said, oh, maybe for something that happened in your youth, let's say something that has to do with the war, Hitler, I remember his eyes. It was almost as if they could see another world invisible to me, so peaceful. He turned this incredible gaze to me and said, Hitler, he was the most ignorant person I ever met. There was no fear and no contempt in his voice and in his gaze, just a quiet, full compassion. He had shifted from a dualistic vision of good versus bad to another one, exactly the one my Tibetan master was and is teaching. In that very moment, my father was experiencing his own perfect true nature. From there, he could see how each and every one of us is endowed with a perfect nature, which is mostly hidden to our ordinary mind by defilements. Here, on the top, you can put the greatest souls of our planet, who realize their true nature, or divine nature if you prefer. I'm sure each of you knows whom to put here, isn't it? Here, you can put those who are so far from having experienced their true nature that their actions are completely obscured, completely wrong. And I guess you know whom to put here also. Since then, I use nothing else than compassion-oriented empathy when I care for the dying. For instance, when I deal with someone who has been abused as a child, a traumatism that often remains hidden for a long time, having never been addressed or transformed, and that pops up spontaneously at the end of life. At the end of life, there is no time for psychotherapy, so I cannot address the dying to a psychotherapist. What I need is a quick strategy. So I go into a deep meditation state and I guide the person into the same state. What makes this strategy especially good for a dying is that the dying are very empathic. So they tune into the state you are in very easily. From that state, the person can see the other side of his or her story. Now I'm strong, told me a woman who had been raped at the age of 12 and who was dying with cancer. She passed away in strength, respect for herself, and her mind full of compassion for her aggressor. Thank you so much for listening.